The American Cup 2025. In the men's section, we have the best USA chess players. Mostly familiar faces. Top 4 Nakamura, Caruana, So, Aronian. Second tier in Dominguez, Robson, Sevian. And the newcomer to the big stage, the youngest world grandmaster, ABHIMANYU Mishra. Knockout system, and in the first round, legendary Hikaru Nakamura, top-rated player in the tournament, was paired against Mishra, 16-year-old genius who became the grandmaster at the age of 12. First two classical games ended in a draw, and now we have a blitz tiebreaker. First game, Hikaru plays white, and starts with the ready opening knight f3, knight f6, g3, to develop the bishop on g2, d5, bishop g2, e6, castle, all theory so far, b3, probably the most favorite Nakamura's move to develop the bishop on b2, e3, c5, bishop b2, knight c6. All theory, all standard moves, nothing much is happening, c4, d4, gaining some space for black, exchange of the pawns on d4, rook goes to an open file e, and rook b8. Now white knight cannot be developed through a square c3, which is protected by the black pawn, so knight goes to a3 to be developed through a square c2. Bishop goes to c5, knight c2, putting some pressure on the pawn on d4, b6, d3, blocking pawn on d4, and bishop goes to b7 to counter the white light square bishop on g2. a3 with the idea to play b4. Mishra plays a5 to prevent the move b4, and now to get this idea of playing b4, Nakamura has to make a number of moves, starting with rook b1, then remove the bishop from b2, and then to play b4. Rook e8, bishop removes on c1, e5, and now b4. Exchange of the pawn on b4, hitting the bishop, bishop moves back to d6, and Nakamura plays bishop g5 to pin the knight. h6, hitting that bishop. Now if the bishop goes to h4, then after g5 it's going to be trapped. Therefore bishop takes on f6, queen takes on f6, and knight goes to d2, transferring to a very good outpost square e4. Queen e7, hitting the pawn on b4, b5, attacking the knight. Here what's interesting is that if knight goes to d8, then knight takes d4, using the pin, and white wins a pawn. But black found a very nice move, knight b4, and now they are attacking the pawn on d3. So if knight takes d4, then knight takes d3, and black is absolutely fine. Therefore, after knight b4, Nakamura plays knight takes b4, bishop takes b4, and now we have a series of exchanges. First the bishop takes d2, queen d2, d2, and queen takes b7. And now we have an endgame, which is absolutely equal, maybe with slight advantage for white. But after the move queen e2, rook a8, an exchange of the rooks on a1, actually black is more active after the move e4. Exchange of the pawns on e4, Mishra activates his rook. Rook takes e4. Position is still even, but feels like black is a little better. Queen d3, and now g6, because if king goes in some variations on h7, the rook would be pinned, so g6 allows the king to go to g7 and h7 in future variations. Queen d2 hitting the pawn on h6, h5, h4 blocking that pawn, queen e7, king g2, and queen b7, creating some discovery attack threats. And therefore king goes back, queen e7, and in this position, by repeating the move, Mishra basically saying that he is okay with the draw. But Nakamura is not okay with the draw. He plays rook d1 and continues the game, king h7, king g2, another threat of discovery attack, and king goes to h2, which turned out to be a mistake because black plays a nice move, queen c7. And what happens now? It's a double attack on the pawn on c4 and also on the pawn on h4 because the pawn on g3 protecting the pawn on h4 is pinned. And black and white cannot protect both pawns. Nakamura plays queen d3, attacking the rook, and the rook takes h4, again, using the pin. King g2 and rook g4. And now Mishra has an extra pawn, but still this position is pretty much drawish. The game continues with rook e1, queen b7 check, king h2, and h4. And now white king is really not safe at all. King goes to h3 and rook g5. In this position, the best continuation for black was queen d7. Again, x-raying the white king and threatening some discovery attacks with the rook. And after, let's say, king g2, exchange of the pawns on g3, this position is very much in favor of black. After queen d6, they will just put tremendous pressure on the pawn g3, and they have an extra pawn. Unfortunately for Mishra, he didn't find that continuation and played the move rook g5 and allowed white to take the pawn on d4, equalizing the game, but for whatever reason, Hikaru Nakamura didn't take the pawn and played g4. And now black position is totally winning. f5, f3, and here Mishra had to find the move queen c7, threatening the checkmate on g3, and that would have been devastating for white. With 8 seconds to go, Mishra didn't find that move. He exchanged the pawn on g4 and played queen f7. And after that move, this game is already even. The position is even. After queen e4, rook c5, and Nakamura makes a critical mistake, taking the pawn on d4. He had 4 seconds to go, actually 2 seconds to go. He made the move, and now he has 4 seconds to go, but because there are 2-second increments for every move made. But this position is lost in a couple of moves. After queen f3 check, if king takes on h4, g5 check, and this is a checkmate. And if king moves back to h2, queen g3 check, king h1, and Mishra wins a rook. With 7 seconds to go, Mishra didn't find this, and he played rook takes c4. Nakamura finds a nice tactical shot. Rook e7, pinning the queen, and now queen has to take on e7, and queen takes c4. Black has an extra pawn, but this is a draw. The only thing white have to make sure that they don't exchange the queens. They don't allow black to exchange the queens, because if there are no queens in this position, then black would easily win with an extra pawn. There were a lot of checks. Now in this position, black cannot take on c6 because they're not on time to prevent the pawn from promotion. King f7, queen c7, queen c8, another check, another check, another check, a lot of checks, nothing much is happening, position is still even, queen d3 check, king c7, queen c3 check, king b8, queen e3, attacking both pawns. They're both protected, but the black queen has to be glued now to the protection of those pawns, but nice move, queen c7, and now Nakamura cannot take the pawn on g3, g5, because there is a checkmate on g3. King g2, queen c2 check, and here Nakamura could play king f3 or king h3, and it's still a draw, and he makes an absolutely inexplicable mistake, putting the king on g1, and after queen c5, he resigned because the exchange of the queens is inevitable, and as soon as you exchange the queens, the white king cannot protect from promotion of the pawns C or H. So if he runs to the C pawn, then H pawn would promote to a queen, and black easily wins this game. So after first blitz game, it's 1-0 in favor of Mishra. Second game, Mishra plays white, Nakamura plays black. Mishra starts with e4, g6. Nakamura said after the game that normally he wouldn't play the move g6, but in this particular scenario, he had to win the second game in order to continue the tournament. So he played something unusual, something to get Mishra out of his element, out of his book. And with 3 minutes on the clock, he just wanted to make sure that he uses his experience and Mishra would take time thinking about the move. So d4, bishop g7, knight c3, a6. This opening doesn't even have a real name. Bishop e3 developing, queen d2, knight d7, h4. Mishra starts attacking on the king side of the board, h6, long castle, b5, f3, protecting the pawn on e4 in the future, and knight f6 and g4. And look at this position for Mishra. He has very active pawns. He gained a lot of space, and you have to give it to the young guy. He plays very active chess. He plays to win, although the draw would be in his favor in this particular game. Knight b6, looking at the square c4 for the knight for Nakamura, d5 gaining some more space in the center, bishop b7, that's a mistake because the bishop basically goes to the wrong side of the board, knight h3 to get to squares f2, possibly d3 for white, c5, exchange en passant, taking en passant on c6, bishop takes c6, and bishop d4, as Nakamura said after the game, this is a great move for Mishra. The best piece black has in this position is bishop on g7. And by putting the bishop on d4, Mishra basically eliminates that best piece from black. The only problem for white here is that he has minute 42 remaining and Nakamura has 2:57. In every game, Nakamura had a big advantage on the clock. Queen c7, g5, exchange of the pawns. Now the knight on f6 is under attack and has to also protect the bishop on g7, knight f4, and here Nakamura actually had to take the knight on f4 and the position would be okay. As he said after the game, he didn't even consider that because he thought that after rook takes ah, bishop takes h8, white's position is absolutely winning, but he, in his calculations, he didn't notice the move d5, protecting the knight on f4, activating his pieces, and that position is very much playable for black. So he didn't take the knight on f4, but instead played bishop takes d4, activated Mishra's queen, and now the queen is hitting the rook on h8, long castle protecting that rook. But after knight takes h5, d takes h5, the pawn on h5 becomes very weak, and the rook on h8 has to protect this pawn, so it has to be glued to this pawn and cannot get into the game. a4. Mishra is playing on the other side of the board now, using the pin. So he is attacking the pawn on b5. Nakamura doesn't have many choices than to take the pawn on a4. Bishop takes a6 check, king b8, and queen b4, pinning the knight. Mishra has a very big advantage here. And here, king e7. That was a very nice move by Hikaru Nakamura. He wanted to exchange the queens and he wanted to entice Mishra to play the move queen a5. That looks very logical, and that's what Mishra played. Instead, all Mishra had to do was to remove his bishop to, let's say, a square e2 and continue with the huge advantage because the king on a7 is not safe. The pawns on a4 and h5 are very weak. isolated. And this position is very much winning for white. But after queen a5, Nakamura found a very nice move, knight a8. And now the queen cannot move from square a5 because the black would simply capture the bishop on a6. So the exchange of the queens is inevitable. And after this exchange, black are back in the game. This position is closer to even. Bishop c4 hitting the pawn on f7, e6, rook h4 trying to double down the rooks on h file to attack the pawn on h5, knight e8 going to g7 to protect that pawn. Mishra activates his knight to go to g3 or f4 to put another attacker on the pawn on h5, knight g7, and knight g3, and now two black pieces are glued to protecting the pawn on h5, the knight and the rook. Here Nakamura makes a very strange move, rook c8, and again, this move just shows that he wasn't in his best shape in these games, because he just blundered out of nowhere the pawn on d6, rook takes d6, king b6, and bishop d5, another nice move, using the pin. So now if you take the bishop with the pawn, then after e takes d5, the bishop on c6 is going to be lost anyway. So there are going to be more exchanges after king c5, exchanges on the square c6. Black has two weak pawns on h5 and a4, and that's on top of the fact that white has an extra pawn to begin with. This position is very much winnable for Mishra. But again, he doesn't even have to win this. As long as he doesn't lose, he will advance to the next round. f4, all logical, rook d8. Now, important to notice that you cannot take the pawn on h5 right now, because after rook h8, it's going to be a pin, and white is going to lose the knight, and therefore cannot take the pawn on h5. Instead, f5, e5, and c3, not allowing Hikaru to activate his rook on a square d4, king c5, king c2, rook g8, and knight f1. Knight is going to a square f3 to attack the pawn on e5. Rook h8, knight d2, knight e8, knight f3, attacking the pawn on e5, king protects the pawn, rook h1, f6, g6, king e7, and now white had to find a pretty simple move, rook a1, to attack the pawn on a4 that cannot be protected, and white would have be 2 pawns up, 10 seconds to go on the clock. Mishra didn't find that move and put his knight on the edge of the board, and that was a mistake because knight doesn't really have to do anything here. He blocks the pawn h, but it wasn't really necessary. Knight d6. So here Nakamura shows his class, shows his experience. When your position is totally lost, you need to create some counter chances. You need to make the opponent think, and you need to try to make an opponent make mistakes. So he attacks the pawn on e4. It has to be protected. Rook goes to e1, and now this rook has to be protecting this pawn on e4, and basically knight and this rook are of equal value at this point, because the rook again is glued to protecting this pawn. Rook b8, knight finally goes back to the game, knight f3, and knight c4. Another attack on the pawn on b2. So now white has to have to make a very unpleasant move, rook b1, very passive move, and Nakamura finds a3. And now you cannot take the pawn on a3 because knight takes a3 creates a fork, and black would win a rook. So b3, check, king d3, knight goes to g4. This position is still better for white. They have an extra pawn, but now pawns on a3 and h5, there were weaknesses several moves ago, but now they are passing pawns, and white have to be really, really careful and play precise moves. And now 6 seconds to go on the clock. Mishra makes a Very bad mistake. No, first he plays knight d2, I apologize. h4. And now Mishra, unfortunately, blunders a rook h1. And I had a feeling when watching this live that Nakamura actually expected that to happen because he immediately, like within half a second, he checked with knight f2, forking the king and the rook. And Mishra resigned, as this position obviously is lost without a rook. So it was 1-1 after 2 games. The third game ended in a draw. And now we have the fourth game. Nakamura plays white, and he again plays ready opening. I'm gonna go quickly in the opening here because it's the same game as they played in game 1 of the Blitz tiebreak. Pretty much the same moves. There are a couple of variations here in exchange on c4, d3. Again, very much standard developing theory moves. Knight goes to e1. Knight b4, a3 hitting that knight, exchange of the pawns of the bishops on g2, knight goes back, rook now activating and possibly hitting the pawn on b5, also not allowing black to play b5, rook b7, f4, rook b8. Black's idea here is to activate the queen side of the board, gain some space with the move b5. Nakamura doesn't allow it playing a4, but he allows black to put the knight on a nice square b4. Again, as the theme of the whole match, Nakamura 2:50 on the clock, Mishra 2 minutes on the clock. g4, attack starts on the king side, queen c6, g5 hitting the knight, knight moves back to e8, rook d2, rook d8 for black, putting some pressure on the pawn on d3. Knight e1 adding another protector. Rook d7 putting more pressure on the pawn on d4. And rook d1 adding another protector for that pawn. Knight goes to d6. Knight f3. And now the threat is to fork black's queen and rook with the move knight e5. Black have to play basically f6 to protect the square e5, e4, knight f7, h4. Again, look at the clock, 2:10 versus 42 seconds. And Mishra makes a big mistake. He puts the rook on a square d6. Why it's a big mistake? Because now, after g takes f6, he cannot take back with the bishop, as he would get forked. So he has to take the pawn with the pawn, and now the g file opens, and Nakamura immediately moves the king away, opening the file for the rook and the queen. Mishra, to his credit, immediately saw the threat of getting checkmated on the square g7 and played king f8. e5. Another aggressive move, attacking the rook, and now you cannot take the pawn on e5 because after knight takes e5, white's position is totally winning. Because after knight takes e5, f takes e5, there are 2 open files to attack the black king, and he will just not survive this. Rook goes back to d7, d4, f5, pretty much the last crucial mistake of the game. Again, only 10 seconds to go on the clock, and d5, just crushing black's position. Queen goes back to c8, and the reason it goes back to c8 because after e takes d5, there would be e6, pinning, forking the rook and the knight. So after queen c8, d6, and it turns out that black bishop is trapped and has no moves. Knight h6. Nakamura wins the piece and puts his rook on d6. Knight f7 hitting that rook, exchange of the rooks on d7. Bishop goes to b2. And the only reason this position is still playable is because black squared bishop on b2 cannot really get into the game so easily. He is blocked by his own pawns on e5, on f4, and it's very difficult to activate that piece. And on the other hand, for Mishra, he has a very good knight on b4, and also the second knight goes to g4. Another good square. Bishop c1, check, king g1, h6, not allowing white to get to a square, g5, exchange of the rooks, and knight d3, allowing Nakamura play a brilliant move, knight d5, sacrificing the knight for a second, but immediately taking it back on d3, exchange of the queens. And this position, believe it or not, although it's an extra piece for white, it's not so easy to win. And if Mishra didn't have only 8 seconds on the clock but a little more time, he probably could have saved this game. But Nakamura experience shows here to full extent. He plays the move bishop a3. It's not the best move, but he is threatening to play a5 and crush this island of black pawns. And all black had to do here is to move the king to c6 and protect the pawn on c5. And now a5 is not a problem, because just b5 and the pawn on c5 is protecting, and this position, believe it or not, is winning for Mishra, winning for black. But he didn't find the move king c6, he played knight e3, and after a5, he had to take the pawn on a5 and continue to play this endgame, which is again winning for white, but not so easily. The last mistake of the game, he placed his knight on c2, seemingly logical move, attacking the bishop on a3. He didn't realize that Nakamura doesn't have to protect that bishop, and he just takes the pawn and sacrifices the bishop on a3. Knight takes a3, and just it turns out that the black king cannot stop a pawn, white's pawn, from promotion. e6, and now if king takes e6, b7, and the pawn is gonna queen on a square b8, Mishra played king d6 and resigned after the move b7. As we can easily see, if king e7 catching this pawn, there is another pawn going to be a queen. So one of them will be queened. Nakamura wins the game in an absolutely great match between those two American chess players. Nakamura came out on top.